Not all superheroes wears capes. Some wear wellies. Wellies.
Hello everyone and welcome to the James Conway Experience. We have a guest that I've really been looking forward to trying to get on the show. A man who embraces the titles that are thrown at all of us and doesn't try to deny them. He just takes them and says, okay, that's what you think, fair enough. A character that I'm very fond of. I've listened to quite a number of his speeches and I can't see much wrong with them. The leader of Clonairon, Mr. Justin Barrett, you're very welcome to Sligo.
That is me indeed, and I'm very happy to be here, James.
Well, it's a pleasure, and what we've done basically, just so all of the audience knows this morning, we have travelled around little bits of Sligo. I've showed you kind of what's going on the ground here in Sligo itself, and we've talked a little bit about the project that I'm running here, and we'll take a gander around now when we have the podcast done, and I'll just show you what we're up to. But look, I have to say it, I think you're standing on ground that you could be a long way ahead of your time, if you get me. I think Johnny Normie just hasn't figured things out yet.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, and I'm under no illusion that I speak for on behalf of, or even to Middle Ireland, or to the electorate as it currently situates itself. But I do believe that when people say, for example, that I'm wrong about things, is that there's a phrase that I use for it, is that being right too early sometimes looks like you're wrong. And that's been true of things that I have done and said in the past. And I think it's going to be true of what I'm doing and saying now too, which is that right at this moment, I might appear in terms of the dissident right or the nationalist movement to be very much on an extreme level, especially in terms of optics, because I don't think there's anything actually extreme in what I'm actually saying. I don't know what its electoral appeal is, but and I'm not really particularly interested in testing it, other than to say what I believe and to say what I think is true. But optically speaking too, I don't particularly pay too much attention as to what I appear to be or what I can be presented as being to the general public. Again, so long as what I'm doing is honest. But I do think that we are not very far away from people being forced to, whether they like it or not, to realise that what I have been saying, what I am saying, and what I will continue to say is exactly where the problem is, where it came from, how it happened, and more importantly, because this is something that I don't think our side has addressed significantly enough yet. We're only at the beginnings of elaborating some kind of perception of that, is what to do about it. And in particular, when we're saying to the Irish people that the situation they're in now is a mess, and people are beginning to realise that it is something of a mess, is what do we want to present to them in terms of where we ought to be as a country and as a nation? And being the political movement that pioneers that is by definition to take on board the fact that you are not going to be speaking on behalf of the majority. You're not going to be speaking even on behalf of the minority, but perhaps to a certain extent the fringe of the minority for the beginning time. But I would say for the beginning time, because I think an awful lot of what we're talking about is simply, what we're talking about, what's happening and what's going to happen is inevitable. And what we're talking about as the solutions will seem too extreme now, but will seem a damn sight less extreme than the alternative, which is for it to continue in the direction it has gone in a very short space of time.
Well, that's one of the aspects, and like I was interested talking to you earlier today about it, is that I think there's a little bit of trouble on, we'll say, our side of things of accepting it's minority opinion as of yet. Do you know? That minority opinion can turn very, very quickly once people realise that, like, one of the things that I am proposing, and we're preparing here for it, is an economic doomsday for Ireland. Ireland's economy is wholeheartedly dependent on outside influences. You know, we have crippled indigenous industries, and that looks like it is coming to a very swift end. And I don't see any presentation by the government as to how they're going to address that, except for perhaps more tyrannical kind of keeping the population down. And as I says, what is the solution to it? Well, we get to it.
Well, the solution that the government are looking to is the solution that is age-old in as far as the Irish state is concerned, which is that they are looking to get the younger people to emigrate, to leave. And that has been the leakage of discontent that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have relied upon for the past century. And it has been a workable formula, so to say, which is to say that what's left of the Irish population, which is a minute part of the overall Irish population that's born in this country and ought to be able to live in this country, is right up until the Celtic Tiger years. It was 50% essentially of the population was exported. 50% of the population was exported. Now, there's two problems with that as we go forward. Is first of all, we've got an immediate economic crisis, which is one that's going to happen to Ireland because we are so utterly dependent on foreign direct investment, and in particular, foreign direct investment from the United States. And there is no question about it. Whatever else that Donald Trump is determined to do, he is determined on this, and we could get into the reasons why he's determined on this, but he is determined to return the manufacturing base of the US economy to the United States. And he is determined to dismantle the economic model upon which Ireland is actually functioning. Now, he's mentioned Ireland specifically, but I don't think he's so focused on Ireland per se as he is on what's actually happening. And of course, he has the political support for this, which is dealing with what is the only way to fundamentally understand the Irish economy. It's a tax scam economy.
Yes, yeah.
And he is not lying when he says it's a tax scam economy. It is running vast amounts of money through the Irish exchequer by faking up the accounts in such a way that the Irish government, by taking less of a percentage in corporation tax, is taking considerably more money than the Irish government ought to be able to take out of an economy which fundamentally doesn't exist. It's an accountancy fraud. And insofar as it's not an accountancy fraud, it's dependent almost entirely on two sectors, which is pharmaceuticals and the tech industry. Again, very mobile, and something that the American administration and the American political class in general are determined on bringing back to the United States in a physical sense. And there's very little else going on in this country, and there has been very little else going on in this country except foreign direct investment since the so-called Whittaker miracle of the 1970s, the late 1960s, 1970s, which were a disaster at the time and are about to prove to be a disaster again. So are we going into immediate economic bad times? Yes. Are we going into long-term economic bad times? Yes, again, because the immediate effect of, say, the Trump tariffs, if they are brought in, or if the European Union caves to the Trump tariffs, which will effectively have the same result, which is the denuding of a country like Ireland of this tax scam status, is that the global economic forces are on a direction which must be inevitably negative for Ireland. So we have two things. Is number one, the Irish government looking to immigration of the young Irish people out of the country as a solution for the economic problems. It's not going to be available. And number two, we have something that we've never had before. And how exactly they're going to deal with this is, they haven't even conceived of it as a problem. Never mind to understand it. Is, okay, you can leak discontent by immigration, but if you're bringing in hundreds of thousands of people in a mass immigration style system,
yes,
and you're doing that into a welfare state system,
yes,
where is the money going to come from when the tax scam economy collapses?
Yes.
You can't leak that discontent. They just won't simply go back, because they're not going to the United States or Australia or Canada, who are already loaded down with their own immigrant population coming in there anyway. They are going to be here, and they are going to be here in huge numbers, expecting to get the same welfare payments that they are used to, in a scenario in which the Irish government are not going to be in a position to pay those welfare payments.
What happens if this is tied to massive inflation, which I think is going to happen? Because they are going to get their same welfare payments, which I believe we're going to be unable to pay anyways, eventually.
Eventually, yeah.
However, if the inflation happens preceding that, the welfare payments that are being paid, they're not going to allow those people or Irish people to have a standard of living of any description.
Well, they can't possibly, because it's quite simple. You can have a welfare state in a homogenous society, or you can have free movement and no welfare state. Because the free movement of people and capital and so on and so forth is based on an efficient capitalist economic model. That's how it functions. Now, whether it functions socially, or whether it functions societally, or whether it functions in a human manner is entirely separate from whether it functions economically. But you could say that in a scenario where you have free movement of capital, free movement of people, is that a scenario of economic efficiency? Arguably it is. Arguably it is, but in the context of actually destroying the fabric of that society and nation. But if you have a welfare state and you have free movement of people, that's not sustainable in anybody's notion of economics, because you have people coming from much, much poorer countries for whom welfare in Ireland is vastly superior to any possible employment prospects they could have in their own country. And you're taking in huge numbers of people who, even if the economy were functioning, they are not economically functionable within the context of a functioning economy anyway. So what's going to happen? Well, you can either inflate that away, which is to say you can inflate the buying power of it away, which is exactly what the European Central Bank did during the entire COVID crisis. They just simply created money, made them the money markets awash with money, which of course devalued money. Anything that's scarce is valuable. Anything that's just constantly being produced becomes common and not valuable. So you either keep the payments, social welfare payments, at the level that they are in numbers, but in buying power it collapses, or you actually do what they did in 2008, and you even cut the headline figure, or maybe you do both of them, and that's quite likely to be what will actually happen.
Yeah, I think you're looking at a situation where they are going to cut the amount, and the amount is inflationary. Its value is way less. I think both of those things are going to happen at the same time.
Well, everybody, working, non-working, welfare, are well off has to have noticed that in the past few years, and in the past few years, we're not talking about an economic crisis. We're actually talking about a time which we have been told that we are on the pig's back, as it were, economically speaking. Is everybody has noticed that the money they have in their pocket is buying an awful lot less than it used to. Mm-hmm. And therefore, people who have maintained their income have not been able to maintain their lifestyle in any shape, fashion, or form. And when I say lifestyle, I'm not talking about Porsches and or even sun holidays on the lower end of what might technically be called a luxury, because you can ultimately do without the sun holiday. But we're talking about bread and butter issues. We're talking about how you actually feed a family, or we're talking about even for individuals how they feed themselves. And this all feeds into the context too of housing and the rental market, and how much of a person's income is going on rent if they are renting, and how much is going just on actually surviving at this moment. And this must be understood, James, and you understand this as well as I do, this is pre-crisis.
That's right.
This is pre-crisis. We are not in an economic crisis now. Now, for an awful lot of people, they are personally in an economic crisis, and it is very real for them. And when they go to the shops, and when they or when they arrive at the day before payday or the 2 days before payday, whether that's a welfare payment or whether that's a wage payment, they realize that they don't have any money anymore. They're in a personal economic crisis. But according to the figures, the GNP, the GDP, Ireland as an economy is doing just fine. So what happens when those figures are no longer good figures either? What happens to the downflow onto people who are suffering personal economic crisis in a so-called economic boom? What happens to people who are dealing with a overall national economic crisis impacting on a worsening personal economic crisis?
Well, I'll put this to you then, Justin. After 2008, our country received massive sums of international money. Some people liked it, other people were against it, the whole lot. However, in return for those loans to be provided, certain Irish sectors were sold off. And, we're in a position now, as far as I can see it, where we have a per head debt that is astronomical. We have very little in the line of national services, or we'll say assets left that have not been sold out already. Mm-hmm. At the moment, we're in a position to service the debt. I think within 12 to 24 months, that looks to me to be absolutely impossible. So who is going to loan a country that has lost all of its indigenous industry, that was reliant on foreign direct investment that no longer arrives, and has one of the biggest welfare state bills per head of any Western nation? Who in their right mind would lend money to a country like that?
Nobody. That's the simple answer. I mean, you can talk about bond markets, and you talk about percentage yields, and you can talk about longevity payments and all the rest of it, and get into market jargon. But the bottom line is exactly as you say, who in their right mind will actually give you something real, as opposed to the token? Like the ECB, for example, tided us over with so-called promissory notes, which weren't even actual money, even within the frame of what the ECB is willing to call money. But in terms of real assets, we don't have anything to sell, so therefore we don't have anything with which to buy. And we have this huge debt. And any normal person, this is the weird part about the Celtic Tiger years when they were happening, however fake they were, is that any normal person in a situation where they suddenly had a huge increase in the amount of money available to them. But they had, on the other hand, this huge debt to one side.
Might have paid off extra.
Might have paid it off.
Yeah.
Or paid it off as quickly as they could, with a view to, well, if I'm ever stuck again, I can go back to the same people and I can say to them, look, we paid you back the last time, so we'll pay you back this time. No, we didn't do that. We calculated it in terms of percentages of meaningless GDP and percentages of meaningless GNP, and we actually continued to add to the figures. So when we were in a boom economy of the 1990s, the national debt went up. When 2008 hit, the national debt exploded. When the so-called period of austerity softened off and we went back into economic growth as such, much less than the boom, but economic growth nonetheless, we continued to borrow money. And as you say, we sold off state assets. We became more and more dependent on foreign direct investment. We narrowed the foreign direct investment that we were looking for to extremely mobile, because at least, back in the 1970s, when the foreign direct investment was, say, in car assembly plants and things like that, at least if we weren't making things from the get-go, we were at least constructing something. But the tech industry and the pharmaceutical industry can go like that. It can move like within 7 days to 2 weeks if it wants to. And in that context, there is still hanging over us all this huge debt. And if people were brought to the realization that that is, in fact, circa €48,000 per person. Mm-hmm. And that is serviceable on a yearly basis.
Yes.
In other words, you don't get, for example, if you take out a house mortgage, maybe that's €300,000, €400,000, if you can get it. Most people can't get a house mortgage now, but let's suppose you could. That's paid off over a 30-year period. But the rollover period in the bond market, the rollover period in national debt, is you need to pay that off and borrow it again within a year. Within a year. When the repayment time comes and you try and roll it over, which is to say you go back to the bond markets and you ask them for some more money, and there isn't any there, that 47,000, 48,000 per person in the country comes directly to your doorstep all at once. And the average person would know that if they owed €48,000 and they had 12 months in which to pay it, that they were in deep, deep trouble. But because it's put in fiscal terms, and because it's put in national budgetary terms, and because the ECB uses market jargon like bond markets and rollovers, as I said, to surround it with, doesn't change the fact that within a year, you're either going to have to pay off that 48,000 or you're going to have to find somebody willing to lend you that money again. And there isn't anybody to lend us that money again. And that's going to be on a national level. So the government is going to have to pass that 48,000 debt on to the average person somehow. And it can only do that by two means. One of them is taxation and the other is cuts in spending. And you can't tax an economy which is in collapse because by definition there's nothing to tax. So you have to have spending cuts. What kind of spending cuts are you talking about? When we had the kind of spending cuts we had during the what we can call, comparatively speaking, the shaky period from 2008 to 2013, 14, 15, compared to what we're going into now. What kind of cuts are you talking about when at that time we were allowed to borrow more money?
Yes, And
we did borrow more money.
Yes.
And yet we had all these cutbacks and we had all these austerity measures as well as the extra borrowing. What kind of cuts are you talking about in a scenario where there can't be any extra borrowing because no one is willing to lend you the money, because there is no way you can repay that money, and no prospect at any conceivable time in the future that you're going to be able to repay that money? It's probably not within the conception of any person.
Well,
the
only
economic situation we would be in.
No, but the only period of time that I can historically draw from and say, we're looking very likely at that is you go from the late 1890s with Germany, and they had a relative economic boom, and it was all principalities up until that point, and then they drew the principalities together, they got the nation, they still had a bit of an empire at the time, and then, you just go through the calendar of events. You had World War One, and then at the end of World War One, they put reparations on them. Similar to what happened ourselves in 2008, we had the reparations, we had to pay them back. Yeah. But in the same time then, the government came up with this wonderful idea that, to pay these reparations, we could always print. Couldn't we print a bit of money? Wouldn't that sort it out? Yeah. Which led to the hyperinflation. And then all of a sudden, that was maybe 22 or 23, bang, 29, global recession. So in the space of 30 years, you had a nation that had saved, for 2 generations previous, because the Germans were frugal people.
They are by nature,
frugal people.
Much more than we are.
Far more than we are. Who had seen generational wealth completely and utterly wiped out.
Yes.
And then absolutely no jobs and nothing around them except depravity and all of this. And all of a sudden, what did they do? They get this small man from Austria who has an idea, and they say, that's the idea for us. But I'm looking at the period now in Ireland. I go back from him. We're on the same train track. We're on the exact same train track.
Exactly the same train track. And you can talk about the IMF intervention in Ireland post 2008 is the same as the French occupation of the Ruhr in the early 1920s. Except the only way in which we are different is that we are actually in a worse situation, because it is not even Ireland which prints the Irish currency.
Correct.
It was, in fact, the Reichsbank that made the decision to print Germany into its inflationary circumstances in 1924-25, that wiped away, as you say, the generational wealth. But the decision on money printing or money creation is now a matter for the European Central Bank.
But I put this to you then, Justin. Absolutely no European Central Bank agent is worried about the people of Europe. And now they are on about a digital currency in autumn. I have this deep, deep fear that they look at all of the debts they've built up and said, oh, well, we've agreed terms that they're to be paid in euros. And if the euro is worth significantly less, we can pay them.
Yeah.
And I believe that one day that they're going to make that decision. They're going to hyperinflate that currency, pay the debts, and start anew with this digital currency. And it's very frightening to me. I watch finance ministers going over to Brussels and that. The legislation for a bail-in was done in 2016. Greece and Cyprus, you could go to get your money out. You couldn't. You couldn't get your money out. Now, our government is speaking about 3 days without internet and power and stuff like that. I have this deep underlying fear that one day people are going to wake up and they're going to realise, oh, I can't tap my card. I can't get money out of the bank. What's going on? And then, boom, 3 days later, oh, by the way, that few pounds you had, it's gone.
Yeah.
How do you like that?
Well, if you want to take a very practical example of that without even going into the money end of it, is you can just take the storm that we had at the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
And they're going, oh, well, if there's a crisis, let's store up 3 days' supplies. Wait a minute. People were left 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks.
Yes.
Without access to anything.
Yes.
Without access to electricity, without access to water, without access to heat,
Yep.
and so on and so forth. And the infrastructural basis on which just the electricity supply in this country couldn't be brought back online for months.
Well,
People.
I thought it was very telling how in that 72-hour video, your one says, and have a Swiss Army knife. I started laughing because I said, after the bloody 3 days, you're going to need it at this stage. It's ready to go. There's another aspect to it too, Justin. Have to pick your brain on it, is timelines. I'm not going to be the bearer of bad news or anything, but people are not panicking. And I'm very sorry to say it. Like, I was watching last night, yourself weren't in attendance at the Black Forge for the new wing to be launched and all the rest of it, and have the heels up and the pints and all that.
Yeah.
I am absolutely frightened at how few people actually can see the next steps and how quickly they're going to happen.
Yeah. I as I say, I don't like to put a timeline when people ask me for particular dates and so forth, because then they go, oh, well, if it doesn't happen on the 29th of April, therefore you were entirely wrong in your whole analysis, and then we can ignore it. There are certain things that are happening inevitably, and they're happening very quickly. For example, when we talk about foreign direct investment, specifically for the Irish economy,
yes, it's fallen.
Leave outside a general global economic collapse. Leave outside the notion of a vastly inflated euro currency to wipe away the European Union's debts and the debts of all the nation states of Europe. And to look at the United States as well in terms of the de-dollarization. The fact of the matter is the United States actually owes more money now than everything within the United States is actually worth.
Yeah.
So if you sold every piece of land, every house, every factory, every car, every bicycle, they would still be in some amount of debt. Although you can inflate that away. But let's leave that for a moment. Park that, because that as a huge deal. To put a timeline on it, Trump has given us 90 days. Yes. 90 days is the timeline under which either the European Union and the Irish government, Simon Harris is going around the place talking to this person and that person who can't do anything about it anyway. It is the European Union which will negotiate with the United States. And the United States is either going to impose these tariffs if the European Union don't make concessions, particularly in the area of corporation tax, or the European Union is going to make those concessions in terms of corporation tax. And either of those two outcomes within a 90-day period from here creates an economic collapse in Ireland at least.
Yes.
Now, the rest of Europe could be just fine, and you're quite right to point out is the ECB don't give two damns. They don't give two damns about the European peoples in general, in terms of Germany or France or Italian or Spanish or so on and so forth. But you think they care about a tiny little island like Ireland and what the consequences are for us if it's only happening to us? And it will be happening to only us. This cliff edge that we're facing within a 90-day period is something that will just happen to us specifically. It'll damage the rest of the European economy, might even possibly damage the American economy to an extent if there's a trade war, but we are particularly vulnerable. So when you talk about a timeline for a general global collapse, okay, that has to happen. It's coming. De-dollarization is coming. A bipolar world is coming. Put a date on it, I don't know. But 90 days until the Americans impose the tariffs that they have threatened to impose or 90 days for the European Union to come up with some kind of a compromise deal, which would have to relate to corporation tax by definition, which would end the tax economy, which is Ireland. Either way, the Irish economy and the model on which it has been based on is at an end. And how quickly from that 90 days does the fact of the, shall we say, the fact of the economic collapse having happened to it being felt in a very real way in terms of jobs, in terms of employment, in terms of government spending and so forth. Well, I mean, you know, we're not talking about a doomsday scenario that we can trail out into 2027 or 2028 or something like that. We're talking about something that will hit the next budget next November, and will hit the one after that, and will hit the one after that again. And the Irish government only was willing to concede the possibility. This is laughably absurd, and in a very dark way. And I'm afraid I do have a dark sense of humour, so you forgive me for laughing, because it's only funny if you have a morbid sense of humour. Is they only were willing to concede the notion that we might have a recession last weekend.
Yes, yes.
That's the first time they used the words recession as opposed to a possible economic slowdown.
Yeah, no. If you listen closely to the terminologies that are being used, you should be very alarmed.
Yes,
because I remember the period before 2008, and Bertie Ahern was the Taoiseach at the time. Mm-hmm. Some people liked him, some people didn't like him. But I remember a journalist putting it to him, are we too reliant on the construction sector in these global headwinds or something along the lines of that? And his response was pretty much, if you think that way, you should jump off a bridge.
Yes.
That's how unaware they were of what was about to happen. So the alarm bells for me, if they're telling you, oh, well, you know, there could be a recession. What that screams to me is it could means will, and the fact that you're saying that frightens the living life out of me, because you know it's going to be far worse than a recession.
Exactly, because the Irish government, historically speaking, right from the foundation of the state, has always overpromised and underdelivered.
That's
so
right.
If they're promising a bad time, that's a very bad time.
Yeah.
If they are promising cutbacks, what they actually mean is that's gone.
Well,
that thing is gone.
Well,
it's not being cut back, it's gone.
Well, apart from that as well, you have to look at the country that you're reliant on. And we are reliant on America. And I don't think people understand with Trump, you mightn't like him or you might love him. But he is a symptom of what's happening. And what's happened in America is the working class have lost everything. Mm-hmm. They no longer have the capacity for the American dream or the owning of the home or any of that. And what Trump came along and done is promised it all. Mm-hmm. And the position that he's left in now is what's called Hail Mary economics. It's like, you know, the American football.
Yes.
You run the American footballers up there and you throw the ball and you hope that one of them catches it.
Yes.
But they may not catch it, but the game is over. You have to do something.
You have to do something.
And I don't think people in Ireland appreciate how fundamentally, fiscally redundant America is. Mm-hmm. They are finished.
Yeah.
If you look at their currency, their bonds, the amount of money owed outside of the state that's held by China and Iran and countries that you'd never think would be holding American bonds. China and Russia at the moment have the capacity one day en masse to sell everything that they own and destroy the American economy.
Yes. Essentially.
That's the fundamental truth.
Yes.
And that's the country that we're reliant on.
Yeah.
Now, you have a tariff war between America and China at the moment. Mm-hmm. Why has America bases all over the South China Sea? That's to try and choke China. That's their kind of bully tactic to say, listen, we can argue, but we need to be friends because this could go south very quick. The American economy as a concept is over.
Yes.
It was an economy that was based entirely on consumption. And now you're in a situation where they can no longer consume because they can't produce the goods to be consumed, and they're going to have to tariff the country that's producing the goods. So what happens next? Like, for instance, Trump is on about bringing back these manufacturing jobs. What jobs? A modern factory has very few jobs. So you have these, I don't want to say idiots, but they don't understand. They're in Detroit. They lost their job in the car factory 20 years ago. They remember a production line with all their buddies, and everyone was drinking tea at 10 o'clock and 1 o'clock, and we all had work, and we were going home to the missus, and everything was great. And they hear Trump saying, I'm bringing the factory back. And they say, yeah, that's good. Every one of them has been replaced by a robotic arm. It doesn't matter where you put the factory. They're not going to be working in it.
Yeah. And you add in to the unreality of that situation as it's playing out in the United States, the total unreality of what he has promised compared to what he can actually deliver. Because, you know, when he says bring back the manufacturing base to the United States, and to a certain extent he's going to attempt to do that. But insofar as there are jobs there, they are third world jobs now.
Yes.
And the American people aren't going to work at those levels.
No.
Then you come over to a country like Ireland and you have a media commentariat talking about the Trump tariffs and the Trump Hail Mary pass, as you've described it, which is a good analogy to use. And they are trying to pretend, and indeed they're all in agreement on the pretense, that this is somehow something that crazy Donald Trump is doing, because Donald Trump as an individual person is just that capricious and just that irresponsible.
Yes.
As opposed to he is responding to a economic pressure cooker that he's actually in.
Well, if one thinks about it logically, and nobody wants to admit it, and nobody wants to say it to the Americans either, they're at the end of empire. That's all it is.
That is it.
So you take the early 1900s, World War One. Well, the Americans were able to lend the money to the European countries on both sides who were involved in the war because they weren't involved in the war. Then you move on through the period before World War Two. They were able to supply the manufacturing base, sell the vehicles, and build all of these other countries into debt. And then what happened? Europe and Japan, the only kind of people who were in competition to America, were bombed into oblivion. They were flattened. So the Americans came up with the redevelopment scheme. Well, who was given the loans? Oh, America.
Yes.
So America is giving these European countries the loans for redevelopment. And then all of a sudden you have the 50s and 60s where you have America as the main production base in the world. You have this hegemony of, listen, we'll tariff you on this, you tariff me on this, but we'll protect your shipping lanes and all the rest of it. The American people can't get their head around that. They benefited from the industrial bases of the world being bombed into oblivion. The reason they were so great was because everyone else was over.
Yes.
And now you're in the modern situation where you have actual, genuine competition. You have China, India, Africa to some degree has been colonized kind of by the Chinese, but it's coming up a little bit. Then you go down through all the South American companies, and all of a sudden, America doesn't look so great because there's competition. So what does America have? Well, it has the largest military in the world. Does it? Because you take the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. You're in a situation now, do you have the largest military in the world? Because you have all these countries who are willing to work together.
And you also have the question, which you didn't have prior to the Second World War, you have nuclear weapons.
Yes.
Which means that no matter how many tanks you have, no matter how many men with guns you have, if it comes right down to it, somebody is willing to lob a nuclear weapon, which in a life and death situation they are willing to do. The Russians and the Chinese, even the North Koreans, have those weapons. So the option of outspending on military hardware of a conventional nature, and indeed we saw in the Ukrainian-Russian situation the extent of the US support for the Ukrainian side in that, and the amount of money they actually spent to no significant effect. The Russians continued to advance forward. Is it a case that they would have rolled over the Ukraine in about 2 days if there hadn't been NATO support? Yeah, probably. But the fact of the matter is they weren't ultimately able to hold back the Russian army on a conventional basis. And they spent billions and billions of euro doing it. And there's another factor, because you have the manufacturing base, exactly as you said, which has been denuded from the United States from the late 1960s onwards. But you also have, coming out of the Second World War, the emergence of the United States as the reserve currency of the world. Yeah. And that's where their borrowing ability came from. Because the reason why, for example, bankers are not that stupid. They know that the United States borrowed more money than they could possibly ever pay off.
Yes.
But the notion was that if the Federal Reserve continued to create more dollars, well, the Chinese would buy them up, and the Russians would buy them up, and the European economies would buy them up, because that was the global currency of trade. And so everybody had to hold a certain amount of dollars in their shall we say, current account in order to do foreign trade with the United States and indeed with each other. But here we are now entering a period of de-dollarization, because the American economy can no longer maintain its position as the reserve currency of the world, which means that the United States debt, which is not tolerable as the reserve currency of the world, is most certainly not tolerable when it's no longer the reserve currency of the world. The Chinese don't have to hold any dollars. The Russians, the insanity of this was that the Russians were holding a certain amount of dollars because the United States was the reserve currency of the world. And the Biden administration militarized the dollar and essentially said, all the dollars that the Russians are holding are now worth nothing.
Yes. Because
we say they're worth nothing. Could they do that? Yes, of course they could do that, because you can do anything in terms of currency. But the problem with that is everybody else looked at the dollars in their account and went, if the Americans will do that to the Russian dollars, they'll do that to ours. Yes. So we better get the hell out of this dollar.
And hence why now you have Saudi Arabia and countries that had never ever transacted for resources in any other currency than the dollar. They frightened the living life out of people.
They did, and rightfully so.
Yes.
Because they tried to use it as a weapon of war. And two things happened. Number one, they tried to use it as a weapon of war and it didn't work. Then they tried to use weapons of war as a weapon of war, and that didn't work.
Yes.
And now they are bankrupt.
Yes.
And tied back into all of this is this small little island on which we have to live on, which thought it could simply vampire economy off of American wealth and off American debt.
Well, I'll put a few things to you, Justin, and I look at America very closely. And all of these things said to me, there is an empire that is in the death throes of dying. That's all it is. Ron DeSantis, Florida governor or that, a couple of weeks ago, all of the migrants that they've put out, and fair enough, that was their policy or that, introduced new legislation to allow 14-year-olds and 12-year-olds, whatever, to work the fields. Now, we're in 2025 and we're coming up with child labour legislation all of a sudden. Another one, the Ukraine war. Look at it from a logical standpoint. They looked at Russia and they said, well, can't really go nuclear because they actually have more than us. Can't really go conventional because, you know, a lot of guys have tried it over the years and it hasn't exactly worked out for them. So they went financial and they lost.
Yes.
They have entirely lost. Like, I don't think a lot of Irish people certainly don't know it. Russian gas and oil goes to India and India sells it to Europe.
Yes.
That's all that happens.
Yeah.
You know,
That's
and
the way around
a lot of the time it's not even going to India. It's just that a middleman from India makes the transaction and then sends it to Europe.
Yeah.
Anyways,
So it goes on, a different signature goes on the receipt.
it's a middleman. That's all it is.
Yeah.
And then there's Trump, and I have to say it: the tariffs are the last throw of the ball.
Yeah.
There is nothing left.
Yes.
Their economy and everything that they stand for is entirely over. And not one politician in America has stood up to the American people and said, listen, we were an empire, make no doubt about it. We're finished. It's over. The game is played. The country now is filled with a population that is predominantly overweight and sick. The jobs that used to be done in this country have gone to other countries that are far more productive than we are. Nobody wants to talk about this. There's a fantastic documentary on Netflix. It's called American Made or American Factory. It's where a Chinese windscreen billionaire bought a place in Detroit and employed American people. All they were interested in was unionizing and getting rules and regs about when they could have their tea break and how mean the Chinese were. The Chinese have ate their lunch. They have done what America was renowned for, which was manufacturing.
Yes.
And they're better at it. They're quicker at it. And the American mind can't get their head around this.
Yes.
It's over.
Yes. And that's why the Irish commentary are talking about it being a Trump tariff is an illusion in and of itself, because Trump's signing the executive order, but how come nobody in Congress is saying don't do that? That's a mistake. That's a disaster, because nobody has any other solution.
There is no other
There
solution.
is no other
You
solution.
see, and this is the sad reality of it. And it is a sad reality of it. What happens when the empire is over? The crusade.
Yes.
That's what happens. The crusade happens. You whip up the patriotism. You say, we need more land. And what are you hearing now in the modern age? Canada, 51st state. Greenland. I'm taking back the Panama Canal. All of this nonsense.
Yes.
The truth of the matter is, game's over.
Yeah.
And if you can go through every tariff in history, I've read economic books on it, and there's a study. Why was this tariff introduced? What effect did it have? Was it good, bad, indifferent? Absolutely no economist can tell you if it's a good tariff or a bad tariff. The only thing that happens is you introduce it, and the economic conditions at the time will either go with it or totally collapse. That's all that happens. There's a reason why the predominant car in America that's driven is the pickup. Why is that? It's because the profit margin on the pickup is far higher than the car because of the tariff regime.
Yes.
And they literally had to brainwash rural Americans into thinking you need a pickup to maintain their own car industry. Because the truth of the matter was, American cars could not compete with Europe and Toyota on efficiency, on reliance, on any of these things. So what did America do? America slapped a massive tariff on pickup trucks that Europeans and the Japanese couldn't sell them in America. It was far too expensive. And then they coddled the American mind into thinking, you're Billy Big Bollocks, you need a pickup truck.
Yeah. It's the American.
It's the American way.
Yeah. Yeah.
People, No, but I'm not in politics, so I don't have to win them over. And people are stupid. The vast majority of people don't know what goes on anywhere, let alone in their own country. They don't know what goes on in other countries. We have tied our economy to an empire that finished maybe 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. And
That's
it's not
the
like
truth.
this hasn't happened over and over again throughout history.
Of course it happened. The Greeks, it happened. The Persians, take all of them.
Or in more modern times, to take it in globalist terms, is we have the rise of the Netherlands. And how does a small country like the Netherlands become the dominant world economy? Because it is the centre of trade, and the Dutch guilder was the reserve currency.
Yeah,
of the world.
and technological advancement.
And when the military ability to, it was an Anglo-Dutch war, essentially, that ended the reserve currency status of the Dutch currency. And then who became the reserve currency of the world for the next 200 years?
Sterling.
Was the pound sterling. And the centre of international finance capital and all that went with that in terms of military power, in terms of economic power, moved to London. And what happened exactly in the time frame that you're talking about, as America went into its upswing in the run-up to the First World War, during the First World War, between the two World Wars, and then finally capped off by the Second World War. The United States becomes the centre of international finance capital. The United States becomes the reserve currency of the world. At whose expense? At the expense of the British Empire and the pound sterling. And what happens to Britain? Britain goes from being considering itself 20 years on from it when it actually was a world power. It went into the Second World War in the belief that it was a world power that it wasn't.
No.
And it collapsed extremely quickly. The empire territorially was gone by the end of the 1950s. But by 1945, the empire was gone economically.
Well,
the Americans had already.
I'll put another
and it's
one.
happening again.
Yes.
Only this time it's America's turn, and the BRICS countries are coming together with a view to managing that collapse in a way which takes them out of the globalized catastrophe that's going to happen to everybody else. And as you say, then you've got this attempt to save the situation through tariffs. And there's no significant political opposition in the United States. And the reason why is because Donald Trump is not being capricious here. He is making that last throw because it is the only last throw that there could have been. And somebody else would have had to do it if he didn't do it.
Well, you see, this is where people get confused. They look at America and they think it's the centre of democracy and all that. America is an oligarchy that has elections.
Yes.
That's all it is. You can vote blue or you can vote red, but they'll be doing what we tell them anyways.
Yes.
So it doesn't really matter. But on a historical point, when it comes to the crashes of these, and you talked about the Dutch and the English and then on to America, that there's a very interesting thing. But of course, you can't say it on RTE because it's very controversial. In the 30 to 40 years preceding all of the collapses of these empires, open homosexuality in society and a drug crisis always happens.
Yes. Moral degeneracy sets in.
Always happens.
Always happens.
So if you go, the British Empire really fundamentally ended in World War One.
Yes.
So if you go to the late Victorian period, you had your opium dens and you had the characters called, I think they were Mollies or something, which were men who dressed up as women, and instead of them doing it inside in private places or that, now they openly walked on the streets. And then you go to the Dutch. And there's a reason why Amsterdam is the capital of degeneracy of the world.
I'm sure there's lots of good reasons to go to Amsterdam, lots of nice things to say, but nobody ever admits to having gone on a holiday to Amsterdam.
Yeah, that's
and there's a reason for that. Well, no man does anyway.
No.
Because everybody will look at you and go, was it Thailand or Amsterdam? Was that the choice you made between the two? And it's because there's an assumption there.
But that
There's
was
an assumption that you didn't go to see windmills.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
But you see, that was the fundamental thing at the end of the Guilder. It was that period of time where these drug houses and just total promiscuity became, totally acceptable. It's fine. These are signs of the death of an empire. And as I says, America, fair enough, we have tied ourselves to America. When we tied ourselves initially to America, America was a pretty religious fundamentalist state of mind, which was work hard, go to church on Sunday, work your job in your factory, fair enough. We tied to that because we were a similar kind of culture, except we didn't have the work to go to. We were working the land or working the fishing boats or whatever. Now, we have mirrored their absolute decline into degeneracy.
Yes.
Okay? Here's the kicker, and most people don't travel to America to see this. American infrastructure is collapsing. If you go to New York or one of those places, San Francisco, the infrastructure is absolutely collapsing, and the society is collapsing. Now, we think we're very clever, that we're cleverer than the Americans because that's not happening here yet. Yes, it is. Take a look around all of Ireland. Where was the infrastructure that we got from this financial boom period? Now you have a children's hospital where it's quite clearly, an exercise in corruption. It's how much money you can pull from the state to do a job. That's all it is. A bicycle shelter, hundreds of thousands. All of this money is going to cut off very shortly. And the Irish people are going to look around and realise how little they actually have. How many households are trying to pay a mortgage or renting a house at the moment, and the only reason that they can is because of the work that they have? First thing that's going to go there is the care, because most of these people is on a, what is it called, PCP or something like that, weekly payment, and they're waiting to get the lump payment at the end. Well, what if I put this to you? What if you go to the garage and they're not going to roll on the credit? They say, can't take that as trade-in because there's no way I'll sell it. So you come up with that back payment or I'll take your care. How does that sound? Because that's exactly what's about to occur. So when you hear Schwab and all these fellas telling you you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, they're indicating what's about to occur. You will own nothing. And you have characters like Musk and that. People think he's a clown. He's operating 20 years ahead of himself. He's on about these taxis, self-driving taxis and all that, and everyone is saying, well, who'll get in one of them? You will. Because you'll have no bloody car, mate. Do you know? That's why everyone is looking at him and Trump at the moment, and nobody's realising what Musk's game is. It's to bankrupt the entire country. When you have no car of your own, when your state isn't able to build a train track, the oligarchs will come in and provide. That's what happens next. Terrible state of affairs.
But it's a rented thing, and we all, on the simplest level, we already have that. Let's take a reasonably advanced thing, which is like the common possession of a home computer.
Yes.
You used to buy it and you bought all the software, and there you had a working computer you walked out of the shop with, right? Now you buy the basic thing, the machine, and then you rent every piece of software that is actually on it. So if you don't pay the rent on it, your laptop, your PC, it stops functioning. It stops functioning within a very short space of time, and that was the rollout of the rental model. You'll own nothing, and you'll be happy. Is you go back into your house to a PC or to your laptop or whatever, and the operating system on which it works on, do you own it? It looks like you own it. You actually don't.
But sure,
you have a year's license on it.
Yep.
You have a year's license, and then when the year's license is over, then it stops working. So what happens when the the PC itself is on a year's license to you? What happens when the car is on a year's license to you? What happens when there is no car? What happens when you become, it's rentier capitalism, and rentier capitalism is where they are taking us. And it's been obvious for some time, and they haven't even pretended it's going to be anything else. They have said it straight out to us, and the vast majority of people, as you say, have been paying no attention. And what is striking about it is, as you said again, is the absence of panic.
Yes.
And the complete complacency of the average person, the average civil servant, the average government, the average economist, etc., 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 is that, okay, everything's fine right now, this minute. That is a child's mind. Anybody who's a parent to children knows this. It's the key thing about a child's mind is they don't have object permanence and they don't have future awareness.
Yes.
And that grows over time.
And that's why they're so happy when they're children.
Exactly. Tomorrow doesn't mean anything to them when they're small enough. Then a week away starts to mean something to them. Then they start to worry about things that are a week away, whether they'll actually get them or not. And it's a maturing process. And by the time you become an adult, you're supposed to be able to a certain extent, not completely control, because you never completely control anything, but you're supposed to have a 20 to 30 year view. That's what the house mortgage, historically speaking, when it was a working model, was based on, is having a 20 to 30 year view. The average person now isn't able to think, as I said, 90 days ahead. 90 days ahead. And that attitude that is being taken by the ordinary adult, which is a childish attitude, has been transferred even more, with even greater deleterious effect onto actual national policy, an incapacity to plan anything beyond the current circumstance. And by current circumstance, that is within the frame of the next 3 to 4 months. Maximum, the average finance minister throughout the European Union and probably throughout the world, with the exception particularly of the Chinese, who under Deng Xiaoping, which is a long time now, he was on the Long March with Mao Zedong. And he had this concept of the economic model that China is currently working on. He was working on that economic model as an idea and a concept, which would have probably landed him in a concentration camp if he'd mentioned it to Mao, but he decided not to, and he kept it in his head until Mao was dead and he took over. But he had that plan for the economic model that China is now engaged in, while he was still on the Long March in 1949.
That's more or less universal basic income, though, isn't it? Or is it? Or a similar?
Well, it is the idea of having a capitalist economic model to an extent within the context of a dictatorial system in a one-party state. And yes, what's got a kind of a rentier capitalism and social credit and all that goes with that and all the controls that go with that. But that fundamentally you get rid of the notion of Marxist economics in terms of collectivization, of open collectivization.
I think he identified, though, that communism's main flaw throughout the ages had been the Marxist economic policy. Like, he identified that if you got rid of that, you actually probably had a fighting chance of continuing it on.
Yeah,
but that's not in the benefit of the people. That's in the benefit of the party. Like,
it's in the benefit of whatever the ruling class is.
Yes.
Now, if that's a capitalist oligarchical class, as it is in the United States, then that's what it is. If that's the party bureaucracy, as it is in China, then that's what it is. But above all else, the distinguishing feature, I would say, with the Chinese model as opposed to the American model, as opposed to the Irish model, as opposed to the European model, is not its Marxism or its dictatorial nature, but its long-term focus.
Timeline.
They understand the idea that you don't base all your economic prospects, or for that matter, your societal prospects, on what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 months. You base it on an intergenerational basis. And the United States built itself on doing that. And the British Empire, to a certain extent, was built on doing that. And again, before that, and before that, and before that. The Roman Empire was built on intergenerational things, which meant that the fact that one had an insane emperor like Nero didn't necessarily collapse the whole system, because the whole system was worked around the emperor, and the emperor could do a certain amount of damage if he was crazy, but only a certain amount of damage, etc., etc. Because the way Rome worked was on an intergenerational basis. And one of the factors that led to the collapse of Rome, there's two essential. One, and we have both of them now. One is a short-term attitude to every problem. Mm-hmm. And the second is they gave Roman citizenship to everybody in the empire.
That's right.
And let everybody in, regardless of where they were from, and regardless of whether they had any loyalty to Rome other than acquiring this citizenship for their own purpose and benefit. And incidentally, they also built up the bread and circuses, yes, which is essentially the welfare state. Well, and we keep playing this out over and over again. And it's I believe it's Freud that actually used the phrase, is that the definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and always expecting a different outcome.
Well, everyone that's listening, on that note, we're going to head to our Patreon. So we do the second half on Patreon, Justin. And I'll be asking Justin more in-depth questions and things that probably couldn't be asked on YouTube, if that's all right.
Okay.
But it's a pleasure having you here, Justin. We'll take a little break at that and join us on our Patreon. And thanks to all our Patreon supporters for helping us. Thank you.